So welcome to our last panel today. It's a great pleasure to have as a keynote speaker Alexander Somek, a professor of legal philosophy of the University of Vienna. His topic will be on political and pathological self-determination, and if I know Sasha correctly, his emphasis will be on the pathological. Afterwards, we'll have, as commentators, Richard Bellamy first, he's professor at the European University Institute, where he's the director of the Max Weber program. And I think, as I know Richard, he will focus on the pathological aspects of Sasha's paper. Then we have Chris McRudden from Queen's University Belfast and University of Michigan. That's a permanent arrangement. It's a great pleasure to have him with us after he spent 1 year last year in Berlin as a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg. So, without further ado, we start with Sasha.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this wonderful conference. I will not give you a full summary of the paper because I find it quite impossible to summarize my paper. What I would rather like to do is to give you a preface. So I engage in a self-interpretation, a very vain activity to engage in, I understand that, yeah? But I give you an interpretation of the whole point of the enterprise, why I decided to sit down and write on collective self-determination in order to contribute to a conference on global constitutionalism. Why did I do this? This is the first thing that I would like to explain. And then I will highlight two aspects of my paper. The concept of collective self-determination that I tried to develop in the paper, and then the pathological aspect, after all, yeah, coming from Vienna, pathology is our specialty. Okay. The contemporary discourse on global constitutionalism, that's it right next to one of the most prominent proponents of this discourse, no longer puts collective self-determination at the center, and that's an understatement if I put it this way. I, for one, haven't heard one recently address the virtues of the Constitution in terms of popular sovereignty, or that it is an instrument to let the ordinary people speak, or as lending shape to collective self-determination. Rather, this theme is entirely eclipsed by other markers and preferred signifiers of constitutional excellence, such as public reason, deliberation, contestation, proportionality, subsidiarity, pluralism, mutual engagement, and so forth. The explanation, I think, is straightforward, and it is basically twofold. The contemporary discourse on global constitutionalism has a strong liberal orientation. First, liberal in an old-fashioned sense. It is about limits on government powers, from the uppercase constitution to the lowercase constitution, from the uppercase state with a capital S to the lowercase state, from the sovereign state to the member state. Second, it is progressive. The discourse is progressive in the sense that it has an emphasis on rights, on social rights, and, I will return to that in a minute, rights of access. And then, in a very radical sense, it is liberal because it has a tendency to put human rights first and questions of governance second, and it leaves it basically open on the conditions, or it leaves it to another level of discourse to identify the conditions under which this governance has to be organized democratically, or whether in some context we are better advised to leave it to expert bodies. So that's the first reason. There's a certain strong liberal strand in global constitutionalism. Second, and this is, I think, more important, contemporary constitutionalism has grown suspicious and ambivalent towards bounded political spaces. While many still concede to the inevitability of bounded political spaces, after all, we have to count votes somewhere, yeah? There's also a great awareness that the bounded political space, epitomized by the nation states, poses normative problems. So that the bounded political space is no longer taken for granted. The existence of the polity, in particular the national polity, is not taken to be unproblematic. but it's rather taken to pose several problems that have to be solved before we can actually start with the process of collective self-determination. And I think my generation, at least I, have been witness to this remarkable change of attitudes towards the bounded political space. And it concerns what we believe to be normal. I do not mean to say that we believe that the closed political space is wrong, but it is not normal to presuppose it without anything further. We have to identify the conditions that make the use of the bounded political space acceptable. Now, let me remind you briefly that this is a remarkable shift. It may not sound remarkable now that we've gone through the shift already. When you're right in the middle of it, you find it normal yourself that we've seen this shift. But it is remarkable because prior to this shift, the closed political space offered an opportunity for, and here's a Habermasian word, Selbsteinwirkung, yeah? Early Habermas, 1970s, yeah? The opportunity, in particular, to rise above mutual dependence, mutual dependence that we bring about in an unintended way, as an unintended effect of human interaction. The bounded political space posed a problem to those who found themselves within, the relationships of mutual interaction, of mutual dependence, posed a problem for those who found themselves caught within them and lacked the economic power to overcome their effects. For them, the mutual dependence space or the relationships of mutual dependence exercised an insuperable force. And they found themselves, through the bounded political space, in a position to rise above this mutual dependence, to rise above mutual dependence, and to establish control over their lives in a collective manner. The bounded political space offered an alternative to the rather depressing perspective of exercising private autonomy on the basis of the aggregate effect of the private autonomy of others. If you don't have the political space that allows you to govern yourself and to establish legislation and follow self-given laws, all that you do that you can do is to adapt to the circumstances that are created as an aggregate effect of the private autonomy of all others. And in a way, indirectly, this is a case of volonté de tous. We are caught in the volonté de tous of the market, the operation of the markets. I think it's fair to say that from the perspective of progressive social movements, we were generally very sympathetic to the potential of emancipation that the bounded political space offered. And I think until to the beginning of the 20th century, there was much belief on the left that wherever you found a political space that offered an opportunity for emancipation, it was taken for granted and considered natural that it should be used to that end. Wherever there was an opportunity for emancipation, it had to be used. Now, this perspective has shifted. It is no longer our perspective. We are confronted with a new normal, in my opinion, and the new normal is revealed, I think, in two tacit beliefs that we have. The first is not so tacit, the other one is more tacit, but the first is not so tacit. I think we are quite explicit about it. We now view the social world as composed not of finite, bounded political spaces, but the social world is in principle infinite. It's an infinite space of global economic interdependence. Polities are no longer regarded as historical achievements that command respect. Rather, political units are, at least prima facie rendered, as enclosures that are made into this infinite space, as though polities were private property that you take out of a common. And these enclosures create, on the one hand, barriers of entry that are a problem, and on the other hand, as we all know, externalities for outsiders. So the new normal is manifest in discourses that problematize the existence of the closed political space by asking questions under which conditions access has to be given to outsiders, in particular through migration, and then through another discourse that I identify with the identify as the darling dogma of bourgeois Europeanists. And this other discourse is about externalities and how externalities have to be internalized by national democracies. This is our new normal situation. This is how we begin today. There's a second element to it that I find equally remarkable, but it's not so often talked about. This is another and implied symptom of this shift. We are already at the pathology. A symptom, and the symptom is that we tacitly substitute the conversation about social justice with a conversation about inclusion. Inclusion has become the core idea, and it's not social justice. Why? Social justice, unless it is libertarian and follows basic Nosickian principles. So social justice in the traditional Rawlsian sense is about patterns of distribution, and patterns of contribution can only be affected through some political process. And the political process can be effective only if we have a closed political unit. Rather, what we talk about is including those who are outside, or including those who are affected, into the political process of and the space of the bounded polity. So we've shifted our emphasis from social justice to inclusion. This is a long preface to the explanation why I focus on collective self-determination in my paper, and here is the explanation. With this major transformation, with the focus on the exclusionary effect of the polity and on the fact that it creates externalities, collective self-determination moves out of the horizon of constitutionalism. It is no longer at the center of constitutionalism. And therefore, global constitutionalism also loses some of the emancipatory promise that constitutionalism had for ordinary people, as I called them at the beginning of my talk. Rather, what global constitutionalism looks like is like another liberal discourse on rights, another way of talking about the rule of law, a way of addressing questions of multi-level problem solving in the most rational way. But the core principle of constitutionalism that a constitution has to facilitate collective self-determination, that it is something about collective will formation, as we put it in German, Willensbildung, yeah? This is no longer at the center of the project. It comes in only in the second round or in the third round of discussion. Therefore, I think it is important to remind us of the ways in which we can make sense of collective self-determination, even if we have put, in the meanwhile, the closed political unit into question, no longer deem it as something that is given without posing any further problems. And there are three ways of accounting for collective self-determination, and let me sketch them briefly. The first is the hypothetical and counterfactual way. It is the way of true cosmopolitans. They talk about the globe as though the globe were already a global polity and design principles and policies with the intent to have them adopted on the global level. The institutions are that could carry out one or the other normative program that is developed. This is the hypothetical counterfactual way. You could also say it's an advocatory way. They engage in a discourse on behalf of a global people that is not yet organized, because we don't have a strong global public. The second is, and forgive me, and I'm a little bit ironic here, the high-minded way. The high-minded way shifts the focus of collective self-determination from decision-making to deliberative processes. Deliberative processes that we can encounter in the global context, that we actually can encounter in global institutions, that interact and engage with members of the global public sphere. So democracy is then seen as preserved in processes that I would still describe as processes of consultation. And the society that we arrive at is resembling more what Rawls would have described a decent society with a consultation hierarchy rather than a full-blown, well-ordered society. But that's one way of making sense of the process of collective self-determination on the global level. And the narrow-minded legal way is actually represented in my work. The narrow-minded legal way actually looks at collective decision-making, yeah? So what we do once deliberation has run its course, when we've heard all the arguments and counter-arguments, and then say, do you want to have A or B? And then that's the collective self-determination that I'm interested in. In my paper, I try to develop 3 different forms of collective self-determination, and I cannot repeat it here. What I would like to focus on, and I've promised it already, is to give you a brief account of my reconsideration of the basic concept of collective self-determination that I offer in the paper, and then give you an alternative to political self-determination that is actually global and cosmopolitan in its orientation, but it also poses a problem. I think it poses a problem, even though I think it may, from one perspective or another, be actually quite accurate to describe how we live today. So, first point. How much time do I have left? 10 minutes? 5 minutes? 10 minutes, super. First point. In the paper, I make an attempt to derive collective self-determination, the meaning of collective self-determination, from political rationality. This means what it means to behave rationally in the political sphere. And I start with what I describe as, and maybe it's overblown, this characterization, I describe as an antinomy of moral judgment. The antinomy being that I have the right answer, that I feel that I have the right answer to a moral question that actually concerns a whole society, for example, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I also have to recognize that I need to respect the views of others who have also made a very serious attempt to arrive at the right answer. So there's, in a sense, an antinomy between the substantive dimension and the social dimension of our moral judgment. The substantive dimension meaning I get it substantively right, the social dimension meaning that I have to respect the views of others. I can solve, I think, the political way of solving this problem, the way of solving these problems that we call politics in a very civic way, in a very civil way, shifts the perspective from having my substantive moral perspective to viewing myself as a person having a view among others. So I take into account that I have my views while others have their views as well, and each view, in a sense, should count equally. When I thereby shift from getting it morally right to getting along with others, which is also a question of being morally right, however only at the social dimension, my practical rationality shifts into the social dimension, and the question arises for me, under which conditions I may have to yield to the judgment of others. So yielding is the basic gesture that is in play here, also for purposes of collective self-determination. No such yielding to others can ever be unconditional. The example that I use in the paper is that people rule that people convict me to death. And there's, of course, no reason why I should yield to something. Not even Hobbes would have seen reason for me to yield to this. So the conditions for my yielding to the determination of others have to be established as well, and they can be established in a political community also only on political grounds, and so therefore we have to reach decisions over these decisions, which are then constitutional decisions. With this double gesture of yielding to others and thereby also at the same time identifying with something, and I get to the identification at the same time, this is how I try to develop the concept of collective self-determination from the concept of political rationality. I yield to others if I yield to something with which I can identify reasonably. If I yield to someone who is at least part of something which I can identify, I am self-determining. And I think, and I borrow heavily from Christine Korsgaard in this respect, and I think this is also true when we look at the level of personal self-determination. Personal self-determination means to yield to your inclinations, yeah? But you do so on the basis of a conception of who you are as a person, because you want to be consistent in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be present in your own life. You would be a wanton that is thrown around by various inclinations. So, also on a collective level, only if I identify with something that is stable, of course, and sustained in a society, and if I reasonably identify with it, it's not an emotional question, there are reasons for identification, I stay self-determining when I yield to the determination of others. Collective self-determination, therefore, is a matter of yielding to the determinations made by others, on the basis of identifying with something of which they are a part as well as I am a part. And in the political context, it is the polity of which we are part. Now, in the paper, I try to develop this core idea in three different settings. The setting of the citizen, who yields to the determination of the majority. The setting of a foreigner who lives in a foreign country, which is actually, in my opinion, an interesting form of cosmopolitan self-determination. And I lived as a cosmopolitan, as a foreigner in the United States for 12 years. Yeah? So I engaged in this form of collective self-determination. And then finally, the collective self-determination of a detached, rational individual. And this is the point with which I would like to conclude. How can we, assuming for a moment that polities, bounded polities, let's assume that for a moment, that bounded polities no longer matter in a global context, for reasons that are having to do with their powerlessness as well as with the potential adverse effects that they have on others. So let's assume for a moment how we could be collectively self-determined, how it would work. How could we imagine collective self-determination under conditions where political spaces have completely disappeared? That's the thought experiment that I engage in. And what I do and what I offer in the paper is basically a variation on a theme by Joseph Rouse. So in the background of all of this is the service conception of authority. But I give it a Zizek'ian twist, in a sense, Zizek'ian Fallerian twist. So I begin, hybridity is a virtue in postmodernity, isn't it? Okay. I begin with the detached, rational individual, and with our identification, our role model, by using the detached, rational individual as our role model. The detached, rational individual pursues a life project, and the detached, rational individual pursues a life project somewhere on the globe. What does a detached, aside from resources and an education, what does a detached, rational individual need? Well, it needs regulations. Or he or she needs risk regulations, resolutions of collective action problems, and public goods. Who is in the position to provide the detached, rational individual with that? Well, some institution that has authority to adopt a regulation, at least de facto authority to adopt such a regulation, or to provide for collective action, for the resolution of collective action problems. Preferably, for a rational individual, these institutions have to be active on a transnational and global scale, because globally active institutions and transnational active institutions are in a far better position to bring about effective problem solving than national institutions. So, how can a detached rational individual be self-determining? Well, it can be self-determining if it yields to the authority of global regulatory institutions, provided that these global regulatory institutions make the individual comply with reasons that apply to the individual, but which the individual is unable to figure out him or herself. So the basic condition is that it's rational to surrender your individual judgment to these institutions. You know this from Joseph Rouse. Now, the interesting point is that surrendering such judgment in a complex world where we don't understand anything about risk regulation, that surrendering your judgment, again, depends on judgment about which is on a judgment concerning the right institution to which you surrender your substantive judgment. So you have to figure out what the right institution is to which you surrender your judgment when it comes, for example, to food regulations. Do you surrender to the World Health Organization or some European food agency? That's the question. Now let's assume for a moment that we are unable to figure it out yourself. So again, we need judgment substitution in order to figure out to whom to surrender our judgment. So we would have to find the one perfectly rational individual that can actually tell us what are the right institutions to which we surrender our judgments in order to have our life regulated in a manner that makes us completely rational. So that's the idea. Now, interestingly, I don't think that any one of us is in the position to find this one individual that would be capable of telling us what this institution is. If we can't find this one individual, we have to find a substitute for it. And we have to believe in the validity of this substitution. The substitute that we find is, I think, on a global scale, is that we all go with the crowd. And it has nothing to do with the wisdom of the crowd, because Condorcet conditions are not given in this respect. So there's nothing that actually warrants our belief. We just look to the right and look to the left and do as everyone else do. But we have to do so if we are rational individuals, by believing that going with the crowd is the right substitute for finding the one individual that can actually tell us what the right institution is to which we surrender our judgment. So we have to believe in the substitutability, that crowd going is as good as knowing which is the right institution. Now, nobody can rationally believe that in this substitutability, that going with the crowd is the same as engaging in rational conduct. You cannot rationally believe in this. Therefore, you have to delegate the belief to someone else. And that's the irresponsible believer. This is where Zizek comes in, yeah? The irresponsible believer. We delegate the belief to some irresponsible believer, and the irresponsible believer is the one, a fictive irresponsible believer, someone that the unconscious basically creates for us. And is this irresponsible believer to whose judgment we then thereby yield. The fictional irresponsible believer is the other of the detached rational individual to which the rational individual surrenders. The result is a world, and I make it short, the result is a world in which we all go with the crowd. When asked whether this is a sound thing to do, we disavow any belief that this is the case, because on a conscious level we don't believe it. On an unconscious level, we delegate our belief to the irresponsible believer. The result is the emergence of completely conventional authorities. Conventionally, there are certain regulatory bodies in place. Conventionally, I follow the free trade label without ever having examined whether the free trade label on coffee cups is any good, yeah? Because I do as everyone else does. So I give someone authority to do so. We return thereby, and that's the point that I actually want to make, we return thereby to a constitutional design in global constitutionalism that is far more reminiscent of the ancient customary constitution that constitutionalism as a project had the ambition to overcome. So in a sense, historically, we've become full circle. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. Thank you.
Richard.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to engage with Alexander Somek's work. I started off when I was reading it, I was a bit worried because in many respects we hold quite similar views. You might sort of say our different theories of these matters are different species of the same genus, in the sense that I agree that politics is constitutive of constitutionalism rather than morality, and therefore what one has to look at are, in many respects, what I broadly call the democratic qualities of constitutionalism. Now, I mean, of course, since we're talking about pathologies, the narcissism of small differences is the lifeblood of academic discourse. But I think, fortunately, I think there is between us one big disagreement. And it's round that I'm going to put my comments. I should also add that, and my excuse is that you write so much that you write faster than I can read, but I haven't read as yet your book on the Constitution, though I will do. So I got it right. At the heart of your argument as you sort of said, is this picture of politics being necessary because there was moral disagreement and therefore one needs a political authority to choose. Now, of course, this political authority could be a court, but then its status would be political, and we'd be concerned with the political process whereby it delivers its decisions. But for it to be legitimate, for the Constitution to be ours, that of those who are subject to it, it requires some degree of individual endorsement, of political endorsement by those who are subject to it. And then, of course, there's the difficulty that we disagree amongst us, ourselves. So your way of resolving that is to appeal to a form of collective self-determination, which has as its model a model of individual self-determination. And it's that I want to question. So, you know, when this morning I descended to the hotel to have breakfast, I was confronted by the enormous breakfast buffet, which both had sort of too many things for me to be able to eat at one sitting, plus many things which I probably shouldn't eat. But in a certain sense, I was able to make those choices almost in a kind of existential way. I was sort of, you know, am I going to define myself as healthy Richard today and sort of direct myself towards the melon and other such options? Or is it one of those unhealthy days? And I'll just go for the things which taste good. But I'm not sure that you can really see the choice of a collectivity in this existential way. As you yourself say, for that to be possible, it requires a huge degree of identification, not simply with the body to which they belong, but with each other. And I mean, I think there's also another small thing as to whether the choice, I mean, I'm not sure whether this is entirely correct, but I did get the sense that you, as I said, you see the choice that the individual makes as being ultimately a self-defining choice. Whereas, in some senses, I think one does make more rational choices, even between incommensurables and compromises and so on, but which becomes important when it's individuals also doing this between them, where they're not necessarily defining themselves as a collectivity, but actually in balancing their different choices together, what they're doing is in a sense, recognizing their differences from each other, I think. And this really, so the nub of the distinction then becomes whether you understand democracy as being a form of self-government based on popular sovereignty, or whether it has a different basis in political equality and as a mechanism for showing equal concern and respect to those to whom, you know, decisions which falls on all of them have each been taken into consideration in its making and its implementation. And I think the very shift to seeing it as a matter of political equality is, as I said, to recognize that what's at issue here are the fact that we are different. And that the decisions isn't necessarily one that I myself will be able to control. I have an equal say, but that doesn't mean it goes my way. Or now, whereas at the global level, the notion, I mean, I think even at the national level, but at the global level, the notion of collective self-determination, that sets a huge standard to try and reach, and it does indeed seem impossible. But if one's aim is the more modest one of seeking to have mechanisms which give us all an equal say in how decisions are made, and that those decisions should show equal concern and respect, not least for our capacity to have an equal say, then I think it becomes more plausible to begin to think of ways of understanding the way in which the world fits together and the way in which our interdependencies could be balanced against each other, than your model makes it seem at all possible. I mean, so if, for example, you're not, when you delegate authority to another body, you're not literally thinking that that person is acting like a more rational version of yourself, but rather you're asking, well, to what extent are the decisions of that body under the equally authorized and equally accountable to those groups to which their decisions are made? Then that becomes one which becomes more plausible to think of having delegated authorities at the international level in the same way as we have them at the domestic level. It's just part of the division of labor of governance, I think, because one's not making such huge metaphysical demands of that agent in the first place. I think it's possible to at the same time, as in that way in which I've just stated it, suggest. I mean, you don't have to think of a global constitution as involving a global democracy or a global demos. I think that instead becomes possible to sort of say, well, there are certain subunits which still form the focus of most people's lives. After all, say, take within the EU, 98% of the population of the EU stays at home. Only 2% live in a country other than their own and work there. They're the exception rather than the rule. So from that point of view, it makes sense to think of it as remaining under the equal control of the citizens who stay at home, rather than the so-called European citizens who move, and therefore that it should be under the equal control of parliamentary bodies which are nationally located rather than Europeanly located. But that, in a certain sense, is a more feasible representation of how you get political control than one which requires a European, let alone a global demos, to come into being in order to then exercise self-determination at a given level. So that's really my point, that I think you set in the way in which you conceive of the problem, it becomes almost inevitably impossible to resolve at the,
Chris, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you to those who organized it for the invitation. It's always wonderful to be back in Berlin. Thank you. So I want to do two things. One is to try to reconstruct what I think is the argument, and then to offer some minor comments on that argument. And the first thing to be said is that I've tried to reconstruct it in the context of having read the Cosmopolitanism book. So my reading of the paper is very much influenced by my reading of the book, from which it's largely taken. So the first problem is who is the problem that Sasha identifies? And the problem, not to beat about the bush, is you all. So you're the problem. You who advocate a cosmopolitan, globalized future based on some variation of Kantian ethics. You who purport to solve the problems of global legitimacy by urging greater democratic discourse, whilst encouraging more and more fantasies of world government. You who are cheerleaders of a global administrative law based on legitimizing authority through expertise and give us a false hope that we can reassert our power over faceless international bureaucrats. You who are human and fundamental rights advocates who engage in this ultimately fruitless litigation that at best is the equivalent of fiddling while Rome burns, and at worst actually adds to the problem. Those are the problem people. They're the ones who are the targets here. Most particularly Matthias Kuhn. So I'm taking it from the book, in which you are a notable target. So to paraphrase Gilbert and Sullivan in The Mikado, Alexander has got a little list that includes all of you, and he suggests, ever so subtly and elegantly, that none of you will be missed, as he metaphorically cuts off your head. So this is an ambitious, not to say brave, argument to make, not least to this group. So what is the problem? If we are the problem, what is the problem? And what's the gist, therefore, of Alexander's argument? And essentially, so far as I understand it, it's as follows. So although we might each consider that we know the morally or ethically right thing to do, we can't legitimately impose this understanding on others who hold a different view without their explicit consent or their implicit acceptance of the process by which their view is overridden. So politics then replaces personal morality. The way the nation state operates is to establish processes which allow views to be overridden, not because these views are wrong, but because decisions have to be taken with which not everyone will agree. Yet we're prepared to go along with these decisions for the sake of being able to live together. So the classic method by which such acceptance is gained is through voting by citizens. Cosmopolitan globalization strips us of this system of legitimation, leaving nothing in its place to legitimize decision-making other than authority based either on expertise or on morality. So we, or more accurately, you, transfer responsibility to exercise collective self-determination to these experts or these moralists. So in particular, we simply follow others like sheep. Administration or the personal morality of global elites then replaces politics. And we're left passive and disengaged in the face of this abnegation of self-determination, what he calls pathological self-determination. So in the book, this argument's clearly linked to the broader argument about constitutionalism with which you ended your preliminary comments. But I think for the purposes of today, we should reintegrate the constitutionalism issue. So constitutionalism, as I understand Sasha's argument, has gone through 3 stages. So constitutional 1.0, and the exemplar is the United States, focuses on setting constraints on public power through law. Constitutionalism 2.0, post-World War II Germany is the exemplar, I think, focuses on the protection of human rights, judged partly on the basis of what peer states are doing, on the basis of reasonableness and proportionality. Constitutionalism 3, that's the Cosmopolitan Constitution, is where we now are. This refers importantly to the, and I'm quoting, the constitution of nation states under conditions of international engagement. So there are 3 aspects. There's a wonderful, delicious symmetry about all this. 3 types of constitutionalism, 3 aspects of version 3. That's the Cosmopolitan Constitution. So the first is a generation of national and transnational and international human rights institutions, which make explicit the universalism inherent in 2.0. The second element is to make foreigners comfortable with nation states not their own, which in turn leads to the creation of a conception of belonging that's ultimately market-based. And the third, and this is the dark side, as I understand it, of 3.0, that involves transferring, as you said, political authority nationally and transnationally to entities who increasingly administer and problem solve on the basis of their proven expertise outside democratic constraints. So law disappears, the people disappear, the executive becomes dominant. This becomes the mechanism by which global capitalism, which is the ultimate target here, I think, captures the nation state, which remains essential but as a tool rather than as a democratic actor. So Constitutionalism 3, where we now are, ushers in the end of constitutionalism as we know it. Now, there's sufficient truth in all of this that it has to be taken seriously. But it fails, at least ultimately to me, to be convincing in its broad sweep, and I'll identify some ways in which it seems to me to be doubtful. First, how novel is Constitutionalism 3.0? So I'm not convinced it's particularly new, at least in its essentials. So my wife, Caroline, is a tropical biologist, you'll be glad to know. And when she classifies her plants, she acts on the basis of a set of transnational rules that date back to the Code of Botanical Nomenclature of 1867. And the code for zoologists goes back even further, to 1843. And these codes are based on organizations that look, feel, act just like many of the organizations that Sasha identifies as newfangled elements of 3.0. They're almost exactly the same. So too, several of the characteristics of 3.0 are to be found in English pragmatic empiricist constitutionalism. Problem solving, absence of hard legal norms, preference for elite bargaining, strong executive. So in 1929, Lord Chief Justice Hewitt attacked what he called administrative lawlessness in the new despotism in almost exactly the same terms as Sasha is identifying the criticisms of 3.0. So what exactly is that new about 3.0? Second, how global is constitutionalism 3.0? So doesn't our reaction to Sasha's analysis differ considerably depending on where we're sitting, or even more narrowly, of the current state of Greek, Portuguese, and narrow constitutionalism? I can see that it may be an analysis of that, but why does it have wider purchase? Does it have really descriptive analysis that's convincing in India, or in Norway, or in China, or even here in Germany? I'm not sure, but I sort of doubt it. So how much has the national state and ultimate democratic decision-making actually disappeared? So if you're sitting in the United Kingdom, where a referendum took place recently in Scotland about independence, and where another referendum will take place soon on whether to remain in the European Union, then some skepticism that Constitutionalism 3.0 is dominant might be in order. Third, the book and the paper both have a strongly teleological understanding of constitutional evolution. So the Cosmopolitan Constitution is, he says, the consummation of the constitutional project. So it's the final form, he says, in which constitutionalism can, quotes, no longer hide its predicaments from itself. So the constitutionalism project is collapsing. All of this involves a funny and unexamined kind of rather mechanical teleological determinism, which I find highly questionable. Sasha doesn't quite say it this way, but it's trembling on his lips, I think, that constitutionalism is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, to misquote Marx. So myself, I'm more into the role of agency and contingency in constitutional development myself. So you remember, as Cassius says in Julius Caesar, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. I think agency has a lot to do with it, and I'm not sure that's fully captured. Fourth, there's a strongly materialistic understanding of what is, or perhaps should be, ultimately important to people. And I'll quote here, the core constitutional challenge from constitutionalism is to find an arrangement that allows the economically disenfranchised to organize democratic opposition against the economically powerful. So this presupposes, I think, the centrality of economic distribution over all other concerns. So feminism goes out the window, critical race theory goes out the window, queer theory goes out the window. They're all pushed to the sidelines with no real argument why this should be so. So there's even a flavor of, and he mentioned it this morning, I'm glad to say, of false consciousness surrounding those who don't share his preoccupation with global capitalism. But isn't this exactly the type of imposition of elite preferences to which he so strongly objects? This leads to a fifth puzzle. So I'm not at all clear about the meaning that Sasha attaches to his concept of normativity, a term that he uses quite a lot in the book, but doesn't, I think, quite clearly define. So I'm particularly puzzled by the distinction he seems to draw between normativity and moralizing. So it seems that normativity is good, something to be favored, whilst moralizing is used pejoratively. Well, what exactly is the difference here? So in particular, his commitment to redistribution, he's a good, old-fashioned, if I may say, social democrat, that's great. His commitment to redistribution, to democratic self-representation, to justice, seems to me to be driven by essentially moral or ethical considerations. Yet on other occasions, he more than hints at a deep moral skepticism. Perhaps his own rhetoric simply got the better of him, but if not, then I'm confused. Why else would you cleave to social democracy and the rule of law, other than because you've got a set of foundational moral and ethical beliefs? I don't understand. Sixth, Sasha mounts, and here I'm beginning to betray my academic interests, Sasha mounts a no-holds-barred attack on international human rights. Rather than speaking truth to power, he characterizes it as elite moralizing, involving, and this is a quote, internationally swanky adjudication of fundamental rights issues, where, quotes, heated debates about court decisions compensate for the loss of political agency. Quote, that's the end of the quote. So there are at least two problems that he identifies or hints at with international human rights. Judicial adjudication of fundamental rights becomes part of the same problem as the takeover by transnational technical experts. Quotes, trust in the technological and economic expertise of regulators is complemented by trust in the reasonableness of various judicial tribunals. In any event, human rights decisions are merely symbolic, quotes unquote. Morally highly charged, but largely irrelevant to the core problem of sustaining self-determination in a largely administrative world. Human rights then become simply an aspect of the hypocrisy we embrace in order to hide our pathology. That's my reading. So I'm convinced on both counts. I don't see why those engaged in the adjudication of fundamental rights issues are not themselves exercising political agency, and why these issues are merely symbolic rather than core. Nor do I see that such litigation replaces the state legislative processes. As often as not, the issue goes back to the national political level, thus stimulating further democratic debate. It opens up discourse and legitimation discussions, not rather than closing it. So for Sasha, human rights appears to become the equivalent of bread and circuses, titillating but ultimately irrelevant. And I don't agree. Such mechanisms as human rights courts and processes can act, not necessarily, but can act to constrain some of the very forces that most appear to concern him. It would be stretching things too much to claim that human rights practice now embodies the type of robust social democratic rule of law ideology to which he is committed, but it's not too far off the mark. If we're concerned with the effects of austerity policies, and we fear for the ability of a particular state to stand in the way of global capitalism, shouldn't we want to strengthen the globalized forces of organized ethics that we call human rights standards? Isn't he too willing to throw the human rights baby out with the cosmopolitan bathwater? Or to change metaphors, doesn't his scorched earth strategy go rather too far? Seventh and lastly, there's a strong and, again, somewhat puzzling faith in democracy at the national state level. He considers several alternatives to the status quo that he objects to, such as violent resistance and elite moralizing by way of human rights. But he dismisses all of those. The only appropriate alternative to the status quo consists, he says, and I'm quoting now, of political action which depends on the nation state. That's the conclusion for the book. The nation state, he concludes, appears more indispensable than ever, and I take it that's not just descriptively but normatively the case, in confronting the normative questions that the Cosmopolitan Constitution throws up. But why the faith in the state? And what exactly is the state in which he has such faith? Isn't Sasha somewhat blind to the pressing problems of democratic decision-making in a nation-state, problems that predate the wave of globalization? And why would attempts to improve democracy at the national level be successful in any event, since he's already sought to convince us that the type of changes that are necessary to enable democracy to function, such as redistributive social policies, are impossible under current global capitalism? Or is his faith in the nation-state as a site of successful resistance rather weaker than it appears? So at one point, and I apologize for the analogy, but at one point he seems like the depressed donkey, Eeyore, in The Wind in the Willows. So any of you who were ever brought up on English children's stories will know about Eeyore, the depressed donkey. So throwing up his hands in despair, he writes, this is Sasha, that the organization and exercise of effective resistance is increasingly hopeless in an interconnected world. But how does that tally with his more optimistic conclusion on the role of the nation-state? Again, the apparent tension, I think, in Sasha's thinking is unresolved, at least to me. So much to discuss, so little time to do it justice. It's a wonderful paper, and I hope I've contributed to what I'm sure will be a fruitful discussion. Thank you for listening.
I think it would only be fair to give Sasha the word now.
It's a little bit difficult for me because I really don't know where to begin, and I actually didn't see it coming that this would be a panel on my book, yeah? Rather than the more modest attempt to contextualize what I have on collective self-determination in the book and to put it into the context of political rationality. This was the point of the paper, yeah? But let me reply immediately to a few things that I think you got fundamentally wrong. You're fundamentally wrong in reading my book as an attack on human rights protection, because that's not the topic of the book. The topic of the book is the transformation of constitutionalism, where member states submit their own human rights adjudication to an international peer review. And the only model that I talk about all the time is the European Convention system, because I think it is an example for how this can be successfully carried out. Yeah? And I therefore write about the margin of appreciation and all these things that go along with it. That I, from time to time, point out that we go through transformations of constitutionalism where we are all fascinated by certain, yes, indeed symbolic questions, or questions that the Americans call social issues, that questions of how you can live your sexual orientation, for example, are now treated as social issues, and questions of distributions are no longer considered social issues. That I from time to time look at these issues as well, yes, I concede that. But it's definitely not at the center of the book. At the center of the book is the following: ambivalence. And I know it's difficult to state ambivalence because ambivalence is not something that you can pin down. I developed this model of the Cosmopolitan Constitution as a nation-state constitution that submits itself to international constitutional discipline, yeah? In various ways, through the participation in international cooperation in the best possible manner. I didn't spend too much time on this because I was fascinated by the European Convention system, and through submitting to some peer review process. This is the focus. That's one side. I am not writing, I'm not telling the story that the dark side that I identify is the side that then eclipses the other side. I say it's Janus face. It is two faces, not just one face. And you've given my book just one face instead of two faces in the way you presented it. And that's not fair. It is also not fair that you characterize my book by pointing to a teleological understanding, some kind of historical determinism in the manner in which vulgar historical materialism would have organized the story. No, it begins, and therefore it's not about social democratic ideology. It is about the values underlying the constitutional project in the beginning. And it's the values, I admit it, that I identify in particular in the French Revolution. It is about freedom, equality, and solidarity. Yeah? And the one value that I see eclipsed, unfortunately, or in trouble currently, is the value of solidarity. So it's not about combining moral relativism with some unprincipled commitment to social democracy. No, I'm taking constitutionalism seriously in an untruncated and full manner. This is what this project is all about. Why does the teleological element enter into it? Because in the course of the pursuit of this project, the values underlying the project are determined also. Sie werden bestimmt, as Hegel would have put it. Yeah? They become clearer. And the universal element of these values is enhanced. This is what it's all about. The Cosmopolitan Constitution is about addressing the fact that national polities are particular polities, and that this particularity is in tension with the universality of the values of constitutionalism. And it's an attempt to cope, to resolve this tension, yeah, by pushing everything on the international level. So, I can tell you a much more positive story about my book than you have done here. You are completely right in several respects. I didn't study the 1929 article that you cited where someone has made already similar observations. I'm sorry, there's a limit to what I can do. The book has, yes, and it's troubled me, and I was expecting it, that at a certain point I will be beaten up by someone for it. It had a Eurocentric focus. Yeah? India doesn't play a role, and I regret it. South Africa doesn't play a role. Many other interesting jurisdictions do not play a role. But it is written by a European in an attempt to understand the European experience. This is the point of the book. And I think, in all fairness, given that it has some 200-odd pages, and that the focus was not on details, but on transformations of way in thinking in constitutionalism, yeah? That the empirical base on which I was working was more limited. But I concede there's a Eurocentric focus, and that's not good. That's bad. Yeah? I concede this point. But it's just about making things a little bit more manageable. I'm not putting out the guillotine to execute the human rights activists. I respect very much the work that is done by human rights activists. Yeah? But I wonder, is the more effective resistance that we see on the globe not still exercised by vital democratic processes? And I also wonder, as I mentioned in my remark to Hauke, yeah? And I wonder whether we still perceive the world correctly when we look at it through the lens of the constitutional project. Namely, there's some origin of authority. I know you don't believe in it because your constitution had no source. But there are powers. Powers that are first on the national level. Then we delegate these powers. It is through delegation that we create then powers on an international level, and they come back to us. The belief that processes of delegation work so smoothly that the original power is thereby preserved, that the power returns in more or less unmodified form to where it originates. I think what we've seen in the crisis management in the European Union, this belief is increasingly naive. We have to think about these matters in a different way. And the constitutional imaginary of delegated powers obscures what is really the issue here, and the issue is more of governments aided and abetted by powerful economic interests, cooperating on the one hand, And then from time to time, these isolated pockets of national resistance, this is what we see. And maybe that's the constitutionalism that we are confronted with if we only, and I say if we only look at the dark side. But the dark side is not the full picture. It is not the full picture. The book concludes with the dark side, yeah? But before it concludes with the dark side, it has developed a brighter picture too. What I wanted to capture was the ambivalence. Now, in light of this full critique of my book, I have to say that I forgot a little bit what Richard, unfortunately, I forgot, it is eclipsed a little bit. What Richard said. And let me make two replies. The first actually was very interesting, your critique that I assimilate collective self-determination to personal self-determination at the personal level. And you are right in one respect, that I indeed should have included the distance that maintains to the will of others through the concept of legality. So what I follow when I yield to the determinations of others is laws. And with laws, I do not identify. Yeah? Maybe I identify with my personal inclinations and wishes more than I identify with laws. Yeah? And therefore, the analogy is not completely sound. But I would insist that self-determination also has to work if I do not identify with each person equally. If the level of identification is not on the personal level, but rather if I just identify with the collective of which I am part. And the reason for identification with the elective is that I find it reasonable to live at this place. There's nothing ethnic about this. Yeah? The next misunderstanding that I may occasion that I argue in favor of ethnic nationalism, not at all. The reason for identifying with, I know you didn't say that, the reason for identifying with a political collective is that I want to live at this place. And in order to make collective self-determination as something that goes on the individual level conceivable, I think that's all I need. I don't need something thicker. Then you said that everything would be different if I started out, if I conceived of the problem in a different way. But the manner in which you then characterized the self-determination on a transnational level assimilated it, seemed to assimilate it, at least from my perspective, yeah, seemed to assimilate it a little bit to the way high-minded, deliberative, advocates of high-minded, deliberative democracy. I know I have a tendency to use polemic terms, yeah, and this is why I antagonize.
I'm not, but I'm not.
You're not, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. No, but you assimilate it a little bit to deliberative democracy. It is responsible, it is authorized, and so forth. This is what I wondered. Or maybe I didn't get your comment right. Yeah, I apologize. Okay.
Great. We'll again take a number of questions together before we give the floor back to Sasha, and we'll start with Stefan.
Stefan Gosepart from the Free University here in Berlin. So since I didn't read the book, unfortunately, otherwise I would love to engage in the general critique. I can just stick to what you said, Sasha, here. And so two questions here. If you want to start with self-determination because you think that is the way you should build a state or collective, then it seems, at least if one was educated by Habermas and others, very natural, so to speak, to say, well, what needs at least is a certain kind of constitution as a constraint on self-legislation. Because as soon as you say, I'm trying to determine myself, in a minute I would say that I don't think that is the best picture, but if you take that picture literally, you want to determine yourself and you do it together with others, all of a sudden you have a majority overvoting you. You are in the minority. And then you want to make sure that they don't enslave you, that they don't torture you. So easiest way out is that you have a constitution that kind of constrains those collective choices, right? So in that sense, you kind of started. And if you then take the route Richard Bellamy was recommending to you, and I totally agree that you rather should start from the idea of equality. And you said, Richard, equal concern and equal say. And if you take equal say even more literally and say that you have power, that people have power, and that they use their power, you have to have some constraints on how they use their power. And I mean, that they have their equal share and that they use it in a fair way. So you need these kinds of constitution as a constraint, and then, of course, you need it for other purposes as well. But there seemed to be, for me, a very short way, natural way to get from self-determination to a constitution. So I don't see why they should be in conflict. Rather, they seem to be in need of each other.
Yeah, Georg Lohmann, Berlin. My question is, first a little bit to all of the lectures, what was really the understanding of constitution? Traditionally, I would say constitution should have, let's say, 3 elements. Basic rights, a part for the organization of the different powers, and then thirdly, let's say, at least a 2-level system of norms, of legal norms. And I had the impression that Rainer Voss said a lot of how to make a constitution in this understanding, but not really how, let's say, the differences and the tenets between the different elements appear when it comes to a global constitution. So that was a little bit, maybe too much moralized, and I agree what you said. It seems that the third element, the legal form of constitution, was not really mentioned. But if I come to your place, I think you were concentrated by the self-determination. First on the law-giving process of a constitution, and then of course of the legislative part inside of a constitution. And then you say on the global level, we no longer have, let's say, the traditional normative models, and we have substitutes, like this international global law made by private contracts and things like that, or just by following traditional conventions and rules. And that, of course, seems to me that you think that is, let's say, a violation of the normative claim of this emancipatory idea of traditional constitution. So my idea was not really clear in the end. And that goes a little bit to your question. How strong is your, let's say, your diagnosis or your critique by saying there is no way out? Or as you could say, okay, that is, let's say, because the constitutional making process always starts by let's say, fighting against a situation which was not pleased by the people, and so constitution always has this, let's say, revolutionary impact in the beginning.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up the question on agency. I'm not entirely sure, Sasha, what is your concept of agency? And I want to refer to a particular point that you made. You pointed to the fact that bounded political space was no longer considered as unproblematic. And now I wonder, when was it ever considered as unproblematic? Since Benedict Anderson. And so who is the agency who actually considered bounded political space as unproblematic? And I will further that with a reference to a former Humboldt colleague here, Klaus Offe, and the entire social movement literature. There was a huge debate about what kind of political agency is actually legitimate. And Klaus Offe had this famous article in the 70s saying social movements were not legitimate political agency. Now, and you think about, we were just addressing the 60s and the 70s, kind of the rosy times in Hauke's paper. Most of the political action that took place at the time was not considered legitimate even by the sort of the critical academic left. Now, I wonder who, in your argument, makes this point on unproblematic bounded space.
So you have a choice. I can either take another 3, or you can answer immediately to these 3 already.
I would like to answer to these 3. Also, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. And I have one more answer for Chris as well, I hope. Yeah, I have one more answer. I forgot to reply to one point that you made. Okay, Stefan, I don't see, I don't see us in disagreement, because the first point that I would make in cases of collective self-determination is that we get to majority rule only on the basis of the principle of equality. If we let each view count equally, all that we can do at the end of the day is count votes, because nobody can claim to have better judgment than anyone else. Yeah, that's it. This already presupposes the principle of equality and introduces the principle of equality as the basic constraint in the whole interaction, and therefore this principle of equality will be relevant when I try to identify the conditions under which I reasonably yield to the determinations by others, which will then be constitutional constraints. And this is how I get to, the equality principle is the most fundamental, in a sense, constitutional constraint. I don't have a Fichtian deduction of other constitutional constraints then, but this is how I would work. Now, Georg, I also agree with you that the Constitution consists of more than of basic rights, organizational provisions, that you institute agency for a collective body and facilitate agency for a collective body, and that you also facilitate self-determination. But this is something that I think is in the current literature relatively often forgotten or pushed in the background, that we facilitate self-determination in a constitution, and this is a little bit for explains, Chris, why the nation state is given a lot of attention towards the end of the book, and not to feminism, not to critical race theory. They are well respected. All of these discourses are well established. Yeah? The one thing that is forgotten is the problem of collective self-determination currently. And I conclude with the nation state. And this may be naive, this may be old-fashioned, backwards, and has no future. But you know, I'm also in good company. The way scholars conceive of the European Union now, my example would be Andrea Zangiovanni. This is where I encountered it most recently, is the European Union was created in order to sustain the national European social welfare state, facilitating cooperation among the welfare states so that they have the capacity to solve problems that concern them jointly. Yeah? So, yes, there may be an overemphasis on national resistance towards the end of the book, yeah? But conceiving of supranational institutions from the perspective of the national political process first, and how the national political process has to engage with other national political process in order to accomplish what it aims to accomplish, I think I'm in good company when I emphasize this. Yeah, I'm not in bad company. Okay, revolutionary impetus. You're right, Georg. There's not much else that I can say. Agency. Antje, I may be guilty of reflecting a traditional public law attitude. This may be really guilty of reflecting the traditional mindset of a European public lawyer. Yeah? And we begin in the Westphalian world by taking the nation state for granted. And what concerns us is intervention with the internal affairs of the nation states. That's the one thing that we do not want. And yes, who was the agent originally? Monarchs and princes. And our system of public international law has been created by and for monarchs and princes, basically. And we are undergoing transformations. So this is where it comes from. And I may ignore a lot of interesting things thereby. Yeah, I concede that point.
Daniel Augenstein.
In the beginning, you drew our attention to the way in which exclusion and externalities sort of displace the concern with the political self-determination in a bounded collective, right? And if I understood you correctly, one of the consequences is that of this marginalization and then of possibly the unbinding of politics in the global realm is that all we're left with is going with the crowd. Now, I wonder whether there's not another way to look at this, which is what these concerns with exclusion and externalities really signal is a changing understanding of the polity towards its outside, right? So questions under which we let the voices of other people count against us or yield to their judgments, as you put it. And I think this is a very different view of political agency, because it's still about the self-understanding of a bounded polity, but one that relates differently towards its outside. That's a question, comment. Thanks.
Rainer.
Oh, Sasha, thank you so much. I'm not sure I would ever be able to convince you that people who believe that politics is a challenge of justification and a practice of justification are not high-minded. It's just exercising a force to pressure others to put their justifications on the table, and if they're not good, to contest them. So I'm not sure why you have this prejudice against this form of politics. But now, can I lay out my prejudice against yours? Why is your position not an extreme form of political romanticism, where you believe self-determination collectively, and I think Richard is right, is a form of belonging to a larger self, which is truly you. And you know that by a way of identification where I'm not sure where rationality at some point got transformed into identification and submission to a larger self. So for me, this is a fascinating idea of collective self-determination, but I'm not sure where rationality, contestation, and so on appears. What is more, I think you have a Manichaean way of looking at the political world. Within a national bubble, there is this larger self which truly expresses us, and everything's fine. There's no capitalism, there's no power, there's nothing. Outside of it, as soon as you get a glimpse of outside, there's capitalism, there's power, there's alienation, there's legal structures that dominate you. That's a fascinating idea. But I think, don't use double standards in describing political reality. Describe your own, that there never existed such a form of self-determination. It never existed, and if you ask me, it shouldn't, because that form of thinking of politics as an enlarged self is a form of romanticism that I think is problematic. But if you describe your own reality in realistic terms, with the democratic potentials and the power structures that work against democracy, why not use the same language as I think you said in your response to Chris about the transnational and international world? Describe it as a realm of power and as a realm of struggles for emancipation. Why use that double standard of having a romantic view of the nation and a completely alienated view of everything outside it? I just don't get it.
Rainer, zero? Oh, okay. I thought it...
On again.
No, we can have an exchange. I actually have a very brief question, and I think it nicely follows up on Rainer. And I think to some extent, it's really a brief question, but to me it's puzzling. I think you create it's actually a very provocative but nice way in which you get into the subject, right? Saying, why is it that we problematize collective membership or closed borders so much? And you're right to say it's a question that is relatively recent. The boundary problem, right? Hasn't always been there, but it's a very relevant one. And I think you said it's access for outsiders, and also you thought it replaces social justice with inclusion. So I think the first one is a powerful one. I'm not 100% sure that the second necessarily follows, but I think the deeper question is, why do you think that you can really only exercise your political power and self-determination within closed borders? Because that, to some extent, it's probably a different way of asking Rainer's question. If you're on a school board, you're just making a determination for that school. It's not for a nation, it's not for anything else, it's subject matter specific, but it might be really, really relevant. And for the community that's affected by it, it's exactly what you need to do. It has nothing to do with closed borders. People change, but you're still making a determination which is significant. You could also say even the nation state, we had unitary state, we always had federal state. In a federal state, you might say my decision in my locality or my state or land or a province, what have you, is much more significant than the national one. So even within closed structures as you define them, you always had these multiple levels. And it's not at all clear that only the collective national is the relevant one. So if you open it up a little bit, I think you could find just much more flexibility for very significant self-determination in the sense of either subject matter or in the sense of different layers or levels of participation, which might be extremely significant. So I don't think you should rule them out. And also, it's very interesting that you go at the end, you say it's the rule of the crowd. And I thought you were going to go in a very different direction, because you can say if what you need is coordination, then actually the real interesting dilemma now is that the market provides you perfect coordination. So we actually have an alternative to democratic self-determination, which is a market-based one. And there you have coordination. You have all of those frameworks already in existence. So it can't be that it's following the crowds necessarily. It has to go back to political equality if you want to criticize that. So I think that's really foundational. But you don't necessarily need to go back to closed borders. So I think that's where the puzzle is. I think we agree with you on many of those fronts, but I'm not quite sure why you feel you have to pressure or to put so much emphasis on that particular point. So that's just a question that I have for you.
Okay. And the final question that you'll have to respond to is mine.
The unanswerable question. Yeah?
I'm sure you'll have an answer for it.
The unanswerable question.
It's about the relationship between boundaries and self-determination. Now, in the constitutional tradition, this wasn't much of an issue, or at least it wasn't much of an issue if we think about keeping the boundaries local. On the contrary, there were quite a few constitutional projects either took place within boundaries that were taken for granted, so they were just existed and they weren't questions. That's a French case, more or less. Or it was about expanding the relevant community. As was in the case, say, of Italy or of Germany, where the political units were, of course, much smaller. And the idea was that there was significant emancipatory potential for transcending those traditional, situated, historically grown contexts in which not self-determination, but domination took place. So, given that history, there isn't much in that history which connects the idea of self-determination with small localities, or even it limits the size of the localities. Now, the idea of bounded communities in many ways a misnomer anyway, because there is no such thing as an unbounded community. Now, the principles of bounding it might be different, but even, why is the planetary community not a bounded community? Of course it's a bounded community. It's the limits to those who live on the Earth. And if one day we find intelligent life somewhere else, well, maybe it'll be an intergalactically bounded community. It would still be bounded. So conceptually speaking, the question isn't whether there is a bounded community or not, but how those boundaries, according to which principles or which geographic areas they should be drawn. And that's a normative question that raises all kinds of justificatory issues. Now, when it comes to those, I think what I like about your book, and I recognize it and your argument here, is the deep ambivalence, genuine ambivalence. So what you recognize is the problem, the justice-sensitive externalities, the lack of capacity to solve serious concerns that as self-governing individuals, together with others, we need to solve. And if we think about the present, right now, if we think about the refugee crisis, if we think about the climate change conventions that are going on, none of these issues are going to be solved by one government. Now, we might want to know what kind of procedures, what kind of political actions, in what kind of ways these things might adequately be decided. That's a challenge, but that's a constitutional challenge for how to think about collective self-government beyond the nation state. Now, there are different approaches one might have to that. As lawyers, I am more inclined to first start off with what we have and then think about how to progressively develop through interpretation and concrete acts to move in the direction of more fully realizing the principles underlying the constitutionalist tradition. I find it perfectly plausible, given that a more ambitious approach can be taken for political action that is radically more transformative, and that ought to be radically more transformative. But it would then be transformative with regard to the establishment of adequate political processes in some way or another, whatever your ideas might be, whatever you might think works, beyond the nation state. It can't be right. It can't be right, and it doesn't seem plausible to me that any solution would lie in somehow retransferring whatever sovereignty has been transferred to the internet. If we take seriously the challenge of self-determination, and let's take it seriously, then why aren't you thinking in constructive, either interpretative or more ambitious political terms, in how to design adequate procedures and decision-making capacities, legally structured adequately as we want them to be, on the level beyond the state? Now, if you ask what's the greatest barrier towards that happening, then I think the answer is not, nasty capitalists that don't want it to happen, that just want to roam freely. Of course they do. They're an important factor, no question about it. But the most significant factor are political actors. And do you know which political actors? The executive branch of states. They don't want that. They don't want to give power away. That is the problem. If it wasn't for the executive branch of states, it would have been much easier to engage in, and it wouldn't be so unrealistic to think about ambitious, transformative institutional proposals to institutionalize collective self-determination beyond the state. And in that sense, I think I think Rainer's right to say there's a romantic dimension in your writing.
Then romanticism is good, and I will explain shortly why it is good. Okay.
Yeah, but if it is, it might be.
Okay.
But then it would be a romanticism that I would strongly suggest, invite you to think about and connect to the bounded community beyond contemporary nation state.
Yeah.
That seems to be. It's unclear to me how the particular brand of romanticism regarding to self-determination on a national level could be part of the solution to the predicament that we face.
Global Romanticist Party. Okay, now, let me go through this step by step, one remark after the other. The concern with externalities and exclusion. It is important. It is, however, I think in our discussions, not sufficiently taken into account from the perspective of the polities themselves. Today we look at the polities from the outset, as though the polities were factories, polluting their neighborhoods. Yeah? What we haven't developed yet, even though this is something we would have to develop in the future, is a vocabulary that allows us to identify the issues where nation states legitimately create external effects on others. In cases of economic competition, for example. Yeah? Germany creates, by virtue of its very size, yeah? an enormous externality on Austria. Yeah? But we've come to live with it, we've come to respect it because we respect Germany as a polity. Yeah? The only objection that I have to... what we have not developed yet, we have this repeated concern, but a not very well reflected repeated concern, and this is why I call it the dogma of bourgeois Europeanists with externalities. But we have not yet developed a theory that allows us to identify, to read the legitimate and to identify the illegitimate externalities. This is something that is still missing, that I should have developed maybe myself. Yeah? Okay. I return to going with the crowd a little bit later. The only problem that I have, Rainer, with the discursive approach is that it is susceptible to appropriation by bureaucrats. Yeah?
No,
it is. Oh yes, it surely is. Send us an email message. We communicate with you. We are responsive. Yeah.
The practice of justification is a practice of those subjected. It cannot be taken over by bureaucrats. That's just that there's no.
But what if bureaucrats tell you, we have an email address, you can contact us, you will receive a reply, every statement that you make will be taken into account in the decision-making process? Is this actually the kind of deliberation that we expect? It's better than nothing, I agree. Of course it's better than nothing, yeah, if you get some administrative responsiveness. But the anarchical nature, the free-floating quality of deliberative processes, everything that Habermas has associated with communicative power, none of this, I think, would be preserved once the bureaucratic apparatuses start to absorb and to assimilate the idea.
So we criticize this, but why do we say what they do? Their appropriation we now call deliberation, and all the other things we have other terms for. You give them the word deliberation, what does that mean?
No, but the problem that I see with this discourse is that it is potentially subject to this appropriation. You protest against it, rightly so, yeah? I fully understand it, yeah? But this is why I do not follow you. Political romanticism. If I decide to live in a society, yeah, because that's the place where I want to live, I have to deal with others, yeah? And the fact that I follow them says something about what I truly am, namely a political being. I do not live in isolation. I live among other people. That's part of who I am. And there's nothing metaphysical, nothing mystical about it, yeah? There's nothing mystical about it. Political romanticism is right from that perspective. Now, Rainer, you also I know that my writings lend themselves to these readings, yeah? That you have just applied, the Manichaean world, the pure, innocent, wonderful nation state that is right in the sea of international competition and torn apart, basically. Yeah, that's right. Sometimes I may invite this kind of readings. But if the experience that we have made in the European Union is that the European Union has put on the top of its agenda to make Europe the most competitive market economy in the world, this is not what Marx would have called a project of emancipation. Exactly. Yeah? So, but what if the remains of this project of emancipation...
Also not what this curse theory called the project of emancipation.
No, but I'm closer to Marx and the Jewish question when it comes to this, yeah?
Or
Deutsche Ideologie, right. This is where you find it, yeah? Okay, but this is not what we mean by the project of emancipation. And then when we find the remnants of attempts to arrive at something like social democracy or democratic socialism on the nation-state level, and very little of it, and rather more competitive pressures on the states on the supranational level, it then happens that I develop this simplified picture. Yeah?
Why do classes not exist in your beautiful state? Why are they outside?
The classes? I never said that the classes are outside, no.
Your democracy never exists because it's class rule.
I have never attributed the social classes to the transnational level and said that this is a classless society in the national level. No, the only thing that I would invite attention to is that this is where political processes are still possible, and we should not dismiss it. Yeah, we should not easily cast it aside and say, this is a matter of the past. This is something that we leave to the right-wing people who have some folkish ideas that we do not share. I think that's premature. We shouldn't do that. Closed borders by closed units for a very, very simple reason, and it's because votes need to be counted. If democracy is at the end of the day about making decisions and the counting of votes, we have to have closed structures. I know that there are attempts in the literature to include outsiders, yeah, from time to time in the decision-making process, depending on the subject matter when there is cross-border relevance. I'm aware of that, but in order to get thinking about political matters off the ground, I think it makes sense to say that we have democracy where we can count votes. Otherwise, we have deliberative processes, and with the danger, I don't attribute this to you as a view that you defend, but with the danger that bureaucratic processes will then advertise what they do by saying, well, look at this is all the deliberation that we have, the amount of paper that we've replied to. Crowdfollowing. Why crowdfollowing? Why this emphasis on crowdfollowing all of a sudden in my work? The attempt that I made was to develop an ideal type. And all developments of ideal types, according to Max Weber, include an element of exaggeration. You highlight a certain element, you exaggerate a certain element, in order to make clear what it's all about. So I tried to develop an understanding of collective self-determination for detached private individuals, individuals who are only interested in pursuing the private life project and couldn't care less where they are. Yeah? So that's the basic idea. And then I tried to develop the conditions under which they have reason to yield to administrative authority, and then I say they substitute the rational belief with the belief that crowd following is doing the thing for them. But you know what? This is a real world import. This is what I do all the time. I go with the crowd. I do as all others do. And if we follow administrative regulations that are adopted, and if I follow recommendations, and if I encounter new regulations of, for example, tables of calories, yeah, that the European Union now, I think, makes mandatory to be publicized on menus and so forth, I adopt. I find myself believing that this is a great thing, that it makes me more rational in my conduct. I become, I'm going with the crowd, I do as everyone else do. This may not have been a good example.
But I'm not sure you're doing that. You're following an expert. It's a technocratic, actually, example, what you've given.
But the type of expert that I follow, yeah, is...
And you would do it at a nation-state level just similarly, right? You wouldn't start counting the calories yourself.
If the authority of the expertise, and this is why the European Union is a bad example, but if the authority of expertise were not mediated through some kind of constitutionally based delegation, some process of delegation, if I were, in a sense, in an immediate relationship to the authority, then I would be crowdfollowing if I did it as everyone else does, yeah? And for the reason that everyone else does. You have just given the answer, Matthias, why? You have just confirmed my remark that it would make more sense under current conditions and in the current situation to pull out the Machiavellian perspective, to reactivate the Machiavellian perspective on polities, where we see different groups interacting without a normative framework that actually mediates the conflict, a clash of different groups. Because you've just said what we see in our world today is the executive branch of states that is happy to ignore all constitutional constraints, and the executive branch of states encounters from time to time some national resistance. This is why I have so far abstained from developing a more positive account of how political self-determination would have to function in a transnational context. And this is something that I haven't done in the book, because the book was about developing this ambivalence. It was, of course, out of a certain obsession with the darkness of it, yeah? The beauty of the darkness, yeah? I see that, yeah? But it cannot be, and you're right, and Chris, you're right too, it cannot be the last word. It cannot be the last word, because there has to be some kind of constructive effort that you need to undertake in order to create something. But what you create then will not be something new. It will not be something new. It will be a federal structure where you delegate authority to a higher level in order to sustain yourself, and thereby, dialectically, you alter yourself. You become something different. Yeah? Okay. Sorry that it took me so long. Yeah?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
So we are 30 minutes overdue. I thank you for your patience. We've ended acknowledging the beauty of darkness, but know that this cannot be the last word. But it will be the last word of this conference, at least, to be continued, though, for those who signed up and at the beginning, and the panelists over dinner. So thank you very much, and bye.
Answer. So there is, in a sense, an antinomy between the substantive dimension and the social dimension of our moral judgment. The substantive dimension meaning I get it substantively right, the social dimension meaning that I have to respect the views of others. I can solve, I think, the political way of solving this problem. The way of solving this problem that we call politics in a very civic way, in a very civil way, shifts the perspective from having my substantive moral perspective to viewing myself as a person having a view among others. So I take into account that I have my views while others have their views as well, and each view, in a sense, should count equally. When I thereby shift from getting it morally right to getting along with others, which is also a question of being morally right, however only at the social dimension, my practical rationality shifts into the social dimension, and the question arises for me, under which conditions I may have to yield to the judgment of others. So yielding is the basic gesture that is in play here, also for purposes of collective self-determination. No such yielding to others can ever be unconditional. The example that I use in the paper is that people rule that people convict me to death. And there's, of course, no reason why I should yield to something. Not even Hobbes would have seen reason for me to yield to this. So the conditions for my yielding to the determination of others have to be established as well, and they can be established in a political community, also only on political grounds, and so therefore we have to reach decisions over these decisions, which are then constitutional decisions. With this double gesture of yielding to others and thereby also at the same time identifying with something, and I get to the identification at the same time, this is how I try to develop the concept of collective self-determination from the concept of political rationality. I yield to others if I yield to something with which I can identify reasonably. If I yield to someone who is at least part of something which I can identify, I am self-determining. And I think, and I borrow heavily from Christine Korsgaard in this respect, and I think this is also true when we look at the level of personal self-determination. Personal self-determination means to yield to your inclinations, yeah? But you do so on the basis of a conception of who you are as a person, because you want to be consistent in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be present in your own life. You would be a wanton that is thrown around by various inclinations. So, also on a collective level, only if I identify with something that is stable, of course, and sustained in a society, and if I reasonably identify with it, it's not an emotional question, there are reasons for identification, I stay self-determining when I yield to the determination of others. Collective self-determination, therefore, is a matter of yielding to the determinations made by others on the basis of identifying with something of which they are a part as well as I am a part. And in the political context, it is the polity of which we are part. Now, in the paper, I try to develop this core idea in three different settings. The setting of the citizen, who yields to the determination of the majority. The setting of a foreigner who lives in a foreign country, which is actually, in my opinion, an interesting form of cosmopolitan self-determination. And I lived as a cosmopolitan, as a foreigner in the United States for 12 years. Yeah? So I engaged in this form of collective self-determination. And then finally, the collective self-determination of a detached, rational individual. And this is the point with which I would like to conclude. How can we, assuming for a moment that polities, bounded polities, let's assume that for a moment, that bounded polities no longer matter in a global context, for reasons that are having to do with their powerlessness as well as with the potential adverse effects that they have on others. So let's assume for a moment how we could be collectively self-determined, how it would work. How could we imagine collective self-determination under conditions where political spaces have completely disappeared? That's the thought experiment that I engage in. And what I do and what I offer in the paper is basically a variation on a theme by Joseph Rouse. So in the background of all of this is the service conception of authority. But I give it a Zizek'ian twist. in a sense. Zizek'ian, Fallerian twist. So I begin, hybridity is a virtue in postmodernity, isn't it? Okay. I begin with the detached rational individual and with our identification, our role model, by using the detached rational individual as our role model. The detached rational individual pursues a life project, and the detached rational individual pursues a life project somewhere on the globe. What does a detached, aside from resources and an education, what does a detached rational individual need? Well, it needs regulations, or he or she needs risk regulations, resolutions of collective action problems, and public goods. Who? Those who are affected into the political process of, and the space of the bounded polity. So we've shifted our emphasis from social justice to inclusion. This is a long preface to the explanation why I focus on collective self-determination in my paper, and here is the explanation. With this major transformation, with the focus on the exclusionary effect of the polity and on the fact that it creates externalities, collective self-determination moves out of the horizon of constitutionalism. It is no longer at the center of constitutionalism. And therefore, global constitutionalism also loses some of the emancipatory promise that constitutionalism had for ordinary people, as I called them at the beginning of my talk. Rather, what global constitutionalism looks like is like another liberal discourse on rights, another way of talking about the rule of law, a way of addressing questions of multi-level problem solving in the most rational way. But the core principle of constitutionalism that a constitution has to facilitate collective self-determination, that it is something about collective will formation, as we put it in German, Willensbildung, yeah? This is no longer at the center of the project. It comes in only in the second round or in the third round of discussion. Therefore, I think it is important to remind us of the ways in which we can make sense of collective self-determination, even if we have put, in the meanwhile, the closed political unit into question, no longer deem it as something that is given without posing any further problems. And there are three ways of accounting for collective self-determination, and let me sketch them briefly. The first is the hypothetical and counterfactual way. It is the way of true cosmopolitans. They talk about the globe as though the globe were already a global polity and design principles and policies with the intent to have them adopted on the global level. The institutions are that could carry out one or the other normative program that is developed. This is the hypothetical counterfactual way. You could also say it's an advocatory way. They engage in a discourse on behalf of a global people that is not yet organized, because we don't have a strong global public. The second is, and forgive me, and I'm a little bit ironic here, the high-minded way. The high-minded way shifts the focus of collective self-determination from decision-making to deliberative processes. Deliberative processes that we can encounter in the global context, that we actually can encounter in global institutions, that interact and engage with members of the global public sphere. So democracy is then seen as preserved in processes that I would still describe as processes of consultation. And the society that we arrive at is resembling more what Rawls would have described a decent society with a consultation hierarchy rather than a full-blown, well-ordered society. But that's one way of making sense of the process of collective self-determination on the global level. And the narrow-minded legal way is actually represented in my work. The narrow-minded legal way actually looks at collective decision-making, yeah? So what we do once deliberation has run its course, when we've heard all the arguments and counter-arguments, and then say, do you want to have A or B? And then that's the collective self-determination that I'm interested in. In my paper, I try to develop 3 different forms of collective self-determination, and I cannot repeat it here. What I would like to focus on, and I've promised it already, is to give you a brief account of my reconsideration of the basic concept of collective self-determination that I offer in the paper, and then give you an alternative to political self-determination that is actually global and cosmopolitan in its orientation, but it also poses a problem. I think it poses a problem, even though I think it may, from one perspective or another, be actually quite accurate to describe how we live today. So, first point. How much time do I have left? 10 minutes? 5 minutes? 10 minutes, super. First point. In the paper, I make an attempt to derive collective self-determination, the meaning of collective self-determination, from political rationality. This means what it means to behave rationally in the political sphere. And I start with what I describe as, and maybe it's overblown, this characterization, I describe as an antinomy of moral judgment. The antinomy being that I have the right answer, that I feel that I have the right answer to a moral question that actually concerns a whole society, for example, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I also have to recognize that I need to respect the views of others who have also made a very serious attempt to arrive at the right answer. Who is in the position to provide the detached rational individual with that? Well, some institution that has authority to adopt a regulation, at least de facto authority to adopt such a regulation, or to provide for collective action, for the resolution of collective action problems. Preferably, for a rational individual, these institutions have to be active on a transnational and global scale, because globally active institutions and transnational active institutions are in a far better position to bring about effective problem solving than national institutions. So, how can a detached rational individual be self-determining? Well, it can be self-determining if it yields to the authority of global regulatory institutions, provided that these global regulatory institutions make the individual comply with reasons that apply to the individual, but which the individual is unable to figure out him or herself. So the basic condition is that it's rational to surrender your individual judgment to these institutions. You know this from Joseph Rouse. Now the interesting point is that surrendering such judgment in a complex world where we don't understand anything about risk regulation, that surrendering your judgment again depends on judgment about on a judgment concerning the right institution to which you surrender your substantive judgment. So someone, or you have to figure out what the right institution is to which you surrender your judgment when it comes, for example, to food regulations. Do you surrender to the World Health Organization or some European food agency? That's the question. Now let's assume for a moment that we are unable to figure it out yourself. So again, we need judgment substitution in order to figure out how to whom to surrender our judgment. So we would have to find the one perfectly rational individual that can actually tell us what are the right institutions to which we surrender our judgments in order to have our life regulated in a manner that makes us completely rational. So that's the idea. Now, interestingly, I don't think that any one of us is in the position to find this one individual that would be capable of telling us what this institution is. If we can't find this one individual, we have to find a substitute for it. And we have to believe in the validity of this substitution. The substitute that we find is, I think, on a global scale, is that we all go with the crowd. And it has nothing to do with the wisdom of the crowd, because Condorcet conditions are not given in this respect. So there's nothing that actually warrants our belief. We just look to the right and look to the left and do as everyone else do. But we have to do so if we are rational individuals, by believing that going with the crowd is the right substitute for finding the one individual that can actually tell us what the right institution is to which we surrender our judgment. So we have to believe in the substitutability, that crowd going is as good as knowing which is the right institution. Now, nobody can rationally believe that in this substitutability, that going with the crowd is the same as engaging in rational conduct. You cannot rationally believe in this. Therefore, you have to delegate the belief to someone else. And that's the irresponsible believer. This is where Zizek comes in, yeah? The irresponsible believer. We delegate the belief to some irresponsible believer, and the irresponsible believer is the one, a fictive irresponsible believer, someone that the unconscious basically creates for us. And is this other, this irresponsible believer to whose judgment we then thereby yield. The fictional irresponsible believer is the other of the detached rational individual to which the rational individual surrenders. The result is a world, and I make it short, the result is a world in which we all go with the crowd. When asked whether this is a sound thing to do, we disavow any belief that this is the case, because on a conscious level we don't believe it. On an unconscious level, we delegate our belief to the irresponsible believer. The result is the emergence of completely conventional authorities. Conventionally, there are certain regulatory bodies in place. Conventionally, I follow the free trade label without ever having examined whether the free trade label on coffee cups is any good, yeah? Because I do as everyone else does. So I give someone authority to do so. We return thereby, and that's the point that I actually want to make, we return thereby to a constitutional design in global constitutionalism that is far more reminiscent of the ancient customary constitution that constitutionalism as a project had the ambition to overcome. So in a sense, historically, we've become full circle. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. Thank you. Political space is wrong, but it is not normal to presuppose it without anything further. We have to identify the conditions that make the use of the bounded political space acceptable. Now, let me remind you briefly that this is a remarkable shift. It may not sound remarkable now that we've gone through the shift already. When you're right in the middle of it, you find it normal yourself that we've seen the shift. But it is remarkable because prior to this shift, the closed political space offered an opportunity for, and here's a Habermasian word, Selbsteinwirkung, yeah? Early Habermas, 1970s, yeah? The opportunity, in particular, to rise above mutual dependence, mutual dependence that we bring about in an unintended way, as an unintended effect of human interaction. The bounded political space posed a problem to those who found themselves within, the relationships of mutual interaction, of mutual dependence, posed a problem for those who found themselves caught within them and lacked the economic power to overcome their effects. For them, the mutual dependence space or the relationships of mutual dependence exercised an insuperable force. And they found themselves, through the bounded political space, in a position to rise above this mutual dependence, to rise above mutual dependence, and to establish control over their lives in a collective manner. The bounded political space offered an alternative to the rather depressing perspective of exercising private autonomy on the basis of the aggregate effect of the private autonomy of others. If you don't have the political space that allows you to govern yourself and to establish legislation and follow self-given laws, all that you do that you can do is to adapt to the circumstances that are created as an aggregate effect of the private autonomy of all others. And in a way, indirectly, this is a case of volonté de tous. We are caught in the volonté de tous of the market, the operation of the markets. I think it's fair to say that from the perspective of progressive social movements, we were generally sympathetic, very sympathetic to the potential of emancipation that the bounded political space offered. And I think until to the beginning of the 20th century, there was much belief on the left that wherever you found a political space that offered an opportunity for emancipation, it was taken for granted and considered natural that it should be used to that end. Wherever there was an opportunity for emancipation, it had to be used. Now, this perspective has shifted. It is no longer our perspective. We are confronted with a new normal, in my opinion, and the new normal is revealed, I think, in two tacit beliefs that we have. The first is not so tacit, the other one is more tacit, but the first is not so tacit. I think we are quite explicit about it. We now view the social world as composed not of finite, bounded political spaces, but the social world is in principle infinite. It's an infinite space of global economic interdependence. Polities are no longer regarded as historical achievements that command respect. Rather, political units are, at least prima facie rendered, as enclosures that are made into this infinite space, as though polities were private property that you take out of a common. And these enclosures create, on the one hand, barriers of entry that are a problem, and on the other hand, as we all know, externalities for outsiders. So the new normal is manifest in discourses that problematize the existence of the closed political space by asking questions under which conditions access has to be given to outsiders, in particular through migration, and then through another discourse that I identify as the darling dogma of bourgeois Europeanists. And this other discourse is about externalities and how externalities have to be internalized by national democracies. This is our new normal situation. This is how we begin today. There's a second element to it that I find equally remarkable, but it's not so often talked about. This is another and implied symptom of this shift. We are already at the pathology. A symptom, and the symptom is that we tacitly substitute the conversation about social justice with a conversation about inclusion. Inclusion has become the core idea, and it's not social justice. Why? Social justice, unless it is libertarian and follows basic Nosickian principles. So social justice in the traditional Rawlsian sense is about patterns of distribution, and patterns of contribution can only be affected through some political process. And the political process can be effective only if we have a closed political unit. Rather, what we talk about is including those who are outside, or including
So welcome to our last panel today. It's a great pleasure to have as a keynote speaker Alexander Somek, Professor of Legal Philosophy of the University of Vienna. His topic will be on political and pathological self-determination, and if I know Sasha correctly, his emphasis will be on the pathological. Afterwards, we'll have, as commentators, Richard Bellamy first, he's professor at the European University Institute, where he's the director of the Max Weber program. And I think, as I know Richard, he will focus on the pathological aspects of Sasha's paper. Then we have Chris McRudden from Queen's University Belfast and University of Michigan. That's a permanent arrangement. It's a great pleasure to have him with us after he spent 1 year last year in Berlin as a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg. So, without further ado, we start with Sasha.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this wonderful conference. I will not give you a full summary of the paper because I find it quite impossible to summarize my paper. What I would rather like to do is to give you a preface. So I engage in a self-interpretation, a very vain activity to engage in, I understand that, yeah? But I give you an interpretation of the whole point of the enterprise, why I decided to sit down and write on collective self-determination in order to contribute to a conference on global constitutionalism. Why did I do this? This is the first thing that I would like to explain. And then I will highlight two aspects of my paper. The concept of collective self-determination that I tried to develop in the paper, and then the pathological aspect, after all, yeah, coming from Vienna, pathology is our specialty. Okay. The contemporary discourse on global constitutionalism, that's it right next to one of the most prominent proponents of this discourse, no longer puts collective self-determination at the center. And that's an understatement if I put it this way. I, for one, haven't heard one recently address the virtues of the Constitution in terms of popular sovereignty, or that it is an instrument to let the ordinary people speak, or as lending shape to collective self-determination. Rather, this theme is entirely eclipsed by other markers and preferred signifiers of constitutional excellence, such as public reason, deliberation, contestation, proportionality, subsidiarity, pluralism, mutual engagement, and so forth. The explanation, I think, is straightforward, and it is basically twofold. The contemporary discourse on global constitutionalism has a strong liberal orientation. First, liberal in an old-fashioned sense. It is about limits on government powers, from the uppercase constitution to the lowercase constitution, from the uppercase state with a capital S to the lowercase state, from the sovereign state to the member state. Second, it is progressive. The discourse is progressive in the sense that it has an emphasis on rights, on social rights, and, I will return to that in a minute, rights of access. And then, in a very radical sense, it is liberal because it has a tendency to put human rights first and questions of governance second, and it leaves it basically open on the conditions, or it leaves it to another level of discourse to identify the conditions under which this governance has to be organized democratically, or whether in some context we are better advised to leave it to expert bodies. So that's the first reason there's a certain strong liberal strand in global constitutionalism. Second, and this is, I think, more important, contemporary constitutionalism has grown suspicious and ambivalent towards bounded political spaces. While many still concede to the inevitability of bounded political spaces, after all, we have to count votes somewhere. Yeah? There's also a great awareness that the bounded political space, epitomized by the nation-state, poses normative problems. So that the bounded political space is no longer taken for granted. The existence of the polity, in particular the national polity, is not taken to be unproblematic, but it's rather taken to pose several problems that have to be solved before we can actually start with the process of collective self-determination. And I think my generation, at least I, have been witness to this remarkable change of attitudes towards the bounded political space. And it concerns what we believe to be normal. I do not mean to say that we believe that the closed political